It is a great pleasure to introduce our evening speaker, Dr. Harcourt, Alexander Harcourt, who goes by Sandy. In the United States, as he was telling me, Sandy is a woman's nickname, but in Britain is an appropriate name for somebody called Alexander. Anyway, he is a professor, now emeritus, in the Department of Anthropology at UC Davis. He got his degrees, including the PhD, at the University of Cambridge, where he was in the faculty for many years, until 1989, when he came to Davis. His specialties are the primates, and very particularly the, at least until very recently, the gorilla. He has done research and published about every possible aspect in the life of a gorilla, from neurobiology to social ecology to everything else. And he has also had the fortune to travel to a number of places. I have here a list from his biography of places where he has been in Africa, studying gorillas particularly: Tanzania, Rwanda, Zaire, Nigeria, Uganda, and of course also in the famous, very distinguished Primate Research Institute in Kyoto, in Japan. He has, in his recent age, I don't know whether upgraded or downgraded the subject of his interest. So his most recent book is not about gorilla or primate biology or non-human biology, but it's about humans. So his latest book is called Human Biogeography, published in 2012 by the University of California in Berkeley. Anyway, it's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce to you Dr. Alexander Harcourt. Please come in.
And it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I thank John Avise and Francisco Ayala very much indeed for the invitation. I am going to extend the topic of phylogeography from the talks that we've heard this morning, which have been mostly genetical. I'm going to take the root of philo, the Greek root of philo, which simply means type, which essentially allows me to talk about the geography of anything to do with humans. And I am going to be talking about the geography in terms of genetics, but also in terms of paleontology. I'm going to be talking about tools, for example. I'm going to be talking about linguistics. And in fact, I'll also be talking about other species that will tell us about human phylogeography, human biogeography. Our phylogeography begins in Africa, as presumably everybody knows. The original Australopithecus species, all of them African. Not until we get to Homo erectus do we start getting outside of Africa. So we're definitely, the origins are African origins, and then we move into, of course, the Old World, and finally into the New World, which I'll obviously get onto. Homo sapiens is down here at the bottom here. These species here, all homos, and this has gone blank now. These species here, I'm trying to work two things at the same time. Fairly recently, the wonderful site in Dmanisi, Georgia, run by Lord Kepanidze, which I think is also a wonderful name. He has got something like 6 skeletons, 6 Homo skeletons in this one cave in Georgia. And he argues that there is as much morphological variation among those skeletons as there is across all of these species here. So he calls them all Homo erectus, since Homo erectus was the first of the ones to be named. He reckons they're all Homo erectus. A lumper par excellence. I'm all in favor of lumping. And so I like Lord Kepanidze. I want you to notice Homo sapiens here, how long this genus has lasted. Something like 2 million years. Homo sapiens has got a long way to go just to be an ordinary Homo species. Throughout the talk, when I talk about humans, I mean only Homo sapiens. I say that because quite a lot of people talk about Homo in general, and they call them humans. And some people will even call Australopithecus human as well. I mean just Homo sapiens. I'm talking about only the distribution, the phylogeography of Homo sapiens. Well, we started in Africa. The oldest find so far of a skeleton that is definitely identified as Homo sapiens comes from here 200,000 years ago. It's actually 195,000 years ago with quite a large error bar going all the way up to something like 135,000 years ago. But they've decided that it's 195,000 years old in southern Ethiopia. The whole oldest fully Homo specimen of Homo sapiens as yet. By 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was spread throughout Africa. And by about a little bit less than 100,000 years ago, we've got these art here, if you like. Certainly not naturally caused scratches on bones. The earliest deliberate scratchings performed by any human being coming from South Africa. Some of the earliest and most beautiful stone tools also come out of South Africa, indicating that what we might think of as human culture began in South Africa. By 125,000 years ago, we were in southeastern Arabia. We know this from some tools there that can have been caused only by humans. They're too advanced to have been caused by Neanderthal. We then disappeared from Arabia. As the last ice age approached, 125,000 years was the height of the interglacial. As the last ice age approached, all signs of humans disappear from Arabia. We don't really know what happened to it. And when I say we, I hope you noticed with my first slide, I recognize that the topic of this talk, the subject of this talk, the information in this talk, comes from hundreds of other people. So when I say we, I mean everybody in the world, essentially, who studies humans. My book has a reference list of something like 850 references. So it's not my work that I'm talking about. It's not until the very end of the talk that you will get to any data that I myself actually have analyzed. Well, up until then, it's all everybody else's work that I'm just summarizing. Well, about 60,000 years ago, the first certain date, but I'll come on to how uncertain some of these dates are, we get out of Africa. And by now, and in fact a little bit before that, we're using all sorts of data. Data from the geneticists, data from the paleontologists, anatomists as well. We're using all sorts of data to follow what humans are doing as they leave Africa. There are two routes here. Probably this is the most likely route because that's a fully terrestrial route. But about 60,000 years ago, approaching the height of the last ice age, sea levels dropped by 120 meters or more. There was only a few tens of kilometers across these two gaps here. Not impossible that they could have boated. There's some evidence that, some claims that humans were boating earlier than this. I think this is more likely that they just walked around. But then I'm frightened of the sea. I don't like boating. Now, at the height of the last ice age, Africa was very dry. This is the central Congolese forest here, reduced to almost nothing. Height of the last ice age, the old world, the data, as far as I understand it, there's probably someone in this audience who knows far more about it than I do. The aridity of the last ice age didn't hit the Americas as much as it hit the old world. The Congo forest, which now extends essentially over all of the central Africa there, reduced to a tiny remnant. And people are arguing that it was this aridity at around this time, roughly 70,000 years ago, that Africa started to get really dry, that drove humans out of Africa. Africa essentially became an unlivable place. There's a problem with that argument, and this is the problem with that argument. Nice study by Lane et al. From Malawi, which is just here, lake sediments in Malawi. Isotopic analysis of those lake sediments showed that Malawi was about as wet as it has ever been in its life. So she reckons that this is what the habitat looked like. And in fact, I don't think one needs a reason for humans to leave Africa, a climatological reason for humans to leave Africa. If the climate looked like this, then there will have been a small population in Africa, and the people at the edge of the population might have felt they need to move out to escape competition. If the climate was like this, there will have been lots of people in Africa, and still the people will have felt that on the edge they needed to leave Africa. But I don't think they needed any reason to leave Africa. We're talking about large-brained animals wondering what's on the other side of the fence, essentially. People explore. People always explore. We know that animals explore. And when I used to study gorillas, I really hated those gorillas. When about twice a year, instead of going only 1/4 of a kilometer a day, they went over about 2 days, 6 kilometers. And I had to follow them at 10,000 feet in the Virunga volcanoes in Rwanda and Congo for 6 kilometers. These guys were just exploring, seeing what was out there. And surely big brain species like humans did the same. Well, here are some fairly confirmed dates for our movement out of Africa. You can read the dates here. I don't need to go through them. This is an interesting one down here. 45,000 years ago, and indeed for some thousands of years either side of that, the gaps here were sea gaps of about 100 kilometers. So we know that by 45,000 years ago, humans had to have had some sort of boat. Probably not as advanced a boat as this, but they had to have had some sort of boat to get them across those 100 kilometers of ocean, especially at around this time. It was around 100 kilometers of ocean. Interestingly, it looks as though the next humans did not arrive in Australia until 4,000 years ago. So Australia cut off for the next 40,000 years after the first arrivals. The ones that came next at about 4,000 years ago, bringing the dingo with them, and it looks as though they probably came from India. So we start moving up here now, 40,000 years ago, some dates there. And these dates, as I say, come from a mixture of disciplines, archaeology and genetics as well. 45,000 years ago, a moving across through Mongolia. A nice study site there, largely an archaeological study site, through central Mongolia. We were there 45,000 years ago. That's what Mongolia is like now. We're in the middle of an interglacial. This world has never been warmer. And this is pretty much what summer looks like in the middle of Mongolia, sort of several days of the summer. These are extraordinarily resistant, advanced people managing to survive for several hundred years, presumably, as they made their way across there, the heights of Mongolia. Now then, there are some other dates out there. Of course there are other dates out there. There are lots of questions about when humans moved out of Africa, when humans moved across the world. There's this date here of 70,000 years ago in southern India. It comes from just stone tools. And the arguments of one of these authors here is that the stone tools are humans. The other author argues, no, they're not, they're late Neanderthal. The problem for both of them is that there are no bones associated with those tools. The problem for the Neanderthal argument is that the Neanderthal skeletons are up here, 2,000 kilometers away. So we actually don't know who made these tools. Late Neanderthal, early human, we just don't know. And we just have to wait for more information. And in the human spread across the world, human paleontology, we'll continue to have to wait a lot of the time for simply more information. There are these dates here that you can see, argued dates for the Philippines and for Australia. There used to be something like 20 years ago, a claimed date of 65,000 years ago for Australia. Then it was rejected, saying they took the dates from layers of sand. They analyzed the sand. down into which the human artifacts had fallen. They weren't from the same original layers as the human artifacts, but this date of 65,000 years ago has now been resurrected. So we don't know. There's quite a lot of differences in those dates. 48,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago to 65,000 years ago, that's quite a lot of difference in dates. We just don't know. We're just going to have to wait for more information. Just last year, indeed just last November, this date of 100,000 years ago, in fact 120 to 80,000 years ago, appeared in China, strongly arguing definitely Homo sapiens. If that is true, then of course all these other dates you have to throw them out the window. We just have not found the earliest, which isn't surprising. It's really difficult to find the earliest of anything, especially when you're talking things that are several tens of thousands of years old. But this date here, very strongly argued to be Homo sapiens. It throws into question all previous dates. We simply got to say, if that guy's right, we don't know when humans left Africa. We don't know when humans spread across the world. Some early genetic data from Rebecca Cann, who was mentioned earlier, substantiating our move across the world from Africa nearly 30 years ago. Very important at the time, because there used to be a theory that humans arose both in Asia and in Africa. A unique species if it is, as far as I know, and again, there might be other people in this audience who know more than I do, there isn't another species in the world that has arisen in two places essentially simultaneously. But this really nice early data, far more genetic variety in Africa than anywhere else. We're talking mitochondrial genetic variety. For the geneticists in you in the audience, which I'm getting a sense is pretty much everybody in the audience, this is the D loop of the mitochondrial DNA. I have no idea why it should be more variable than all these other ones. But anyway, clearly a decrease in divergence from Africa, totally fitting the idea that we originated in Africa and moved from Africa across the rest of the world. Now, based on both genetics and anatomy, the Hugo Reyes Centeno et al. Have suggested a variety of routes that we could have taken across the world. And what they've done is use the data on anatomy and genetics and then fed into their models some background rules. Models like go east, young man, go along the coast, go coast and go inland if you want to go inland. And this one here, coast and inland, but get to Australia first. Those rules are fed into there. There's no way with the amount of data that we have at the moment, paleontological data, genetic data, to distinguish between these. These just simply have to be thought of as hypotheses that still have to be tested. All of the routes, presumably, totally valid routes. But I'll come back later to my preferred original routes. Moving into Europe, we got into Europe not too much after we got into Australia, if you accept the 45,000-year-old data for Australia. Data for 44,000 years ago in Italy, and I apologize, I forgot to put the author's name there, 43,000 years ago in Britain. This is a little bit surprising. The Ice Age is really galloping up towards northern Europe. These routes here, they're just suggested routes, really no evidence for them at all. The idea is probably it would be sensible if people moved along the major rivers. There's lots of food near and in a major river. This big arrow here, it doesn't mean that there was a big genetic input from the rest of Eurasia. I've put it there because, very surprisingly, there actually is genetic input from the rest of Eurasia, not just Eurasia, but Eastern Asia. Genetic input at this time here, around 45 or so, 40,000 years or so ago. A surprising genetic input. Another very recent, come on to that, the Ice Age, the glacier, the ice cap, reached southern Britain and reached northern Europe there. So almost certainly the Brits that got to Britain around 40,000 years ago almost immediately had to leave Britain. There will have been just a very nasty pile, and I'll show you it, of ghastly dead land in southern Britain. They almost certainly had to leave Britain at the height of the last ice age. recent finding of a population here got there in around 40,000 years ago, and then apparently, this is a genetic study, stayed there for 20 or so thousand years. Until about 20,000 years ago, then these, if you like, Middle Eastern genes then moved into the Western European population. Very recent study just came out last year. Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthal, by about now, 45,000 years ago, had been reduced to remnant populations in southern Europe. And indeed, maybe by 40,000 years ago, certainly 35,000 years ago, the poor guy was left only in Spain. What happened? Was he retreating in, or she, of course, in the face of the last ice age? Almost certainly not, because early Neanderthals had already been through a previous ice age and survived just fine up in Europe. These guys could do well in cold weather. Almost certainly what was happening is that Neanderthal, me quoting other people, and I believe it as well, the Homo sapiens, the advanced Homo sapiens with its advanced tools, we know what advanced civilizations do to less advanced civilizations. Almost in our lifetime, we've seen less advanced civilizations, less tool advanced civilizations being wiped out by more advanced tool civilizations. Homo sapiens moving through the area, wiping out, pushing back Neanderthal as he went. Interestingly, about the only evidence that Homo sapiens ever met Neanderthal is the finding of what have been identified as Neanderthal genes in humans. Apparently 3 to 4% of the Homo sapiens genome has Neanderthal genes in it, some of them quite interesting ones, apparently having to do with resistance to disease, which would be quite sensible. Neanderthals been around for longer, worked out how to resist European diseases for longer, and that would be the sensible gene for the incoming Homo sapiens to adopt. As far as I can tell, though, as fast as somebody publishes a paper saying, hey, look, there are Neanderthal genes in humans, somebody else publishes a paper saying, no, it's just from a common ancestor. I don't know. I'm in no position whatsoever. There are lots of people in this audience who are, to judge which of those two arguments is the right one. But what I can tell you is archaeologically, it is very, very difficult indeed to find any site where you can see both signs of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. I might say that there's next to no evidence. I don't believe the evidence that's been claimed that Neanderthal produced art. However, the Homo sapiens coming in definitely did produce beautiful art. I could nap a stone like this. This is a Neanderthal stone tool. But these are clearly far more finely made stone tools. And Homo sapiens then is bringing in art. So about 40,000 years ago, we're getting up into Eastern Asia, and around 40,000 years ago, getting into Japan, probably having to cross some tens of kilometers of water to do so, to get into Japan. And two arrows here, those aren't random arrows, this is just how you get into Japan. It looks as though populations came from two areas in Eastern Asia into Japan, as I understand the genetic data. This is a wonderful site up in northeastern Russia. People have been there, signs of people there from 33,000 years ago, height of the last ice age. What on earth are they doing up there at the height of the last ice age? Well, in fact, the ice cap reached about here. This was not covered in ice, too dry to be covered in ice. It looks as though there's argument about whether they actually managed to stay there through the height of the ice age 20,000 years ago, but it looks as though they did, stayed there through the height of the ice age. And there are lots of mammoths up there. These are mammoth bones here. They actually made their huts out of mammoth bones, presumably then covered with skins, but people have found fallen mammoth bones in circles in the shape of what obviously was a hut made out of mammoth bones. So many mammoths were up there. And at this time, the mammoths, unused to anybody with throwing projectiles, you could probably pretty much walk up to a mammoth and stick your spear into it. That presumably explains why there are so many mammoth bones there. And they're still digging up mammoth tusks here. Mammoth ivory, very nice ivory indeed. There's a roaring trade in mammoth ivory coming out of Siberia. Southern Russia here. 2 years ago, wonderful finding that southern Russia, it was a boy, I think he was either 14 or 17 years old, I forget which, has Western European genes in his genotype. So, and these are dated from about, as far as I remember, something like 25,000 years ago. So that long ago, movement of genes, not necessarily movement of people, but definitely movement of genes, all the way from Western Europe into central southern Russia. And subsequently, of course, these genes moved up here, also some Eastern European genes, of course, and subsequently then moved on into the Americas. About 25% of the Native American, and that includes Amerindian genome, in fact, is apparently Western European. But that brings me on to getting into the Americas, the region of Beringia here, here's Siberia here, here's Alaska here. At around the time that humans moved in, and there's argument about when they moved in, but let's say for the moment at around 15,000 years ago, I'll show you a little bit of data to show that that's probably wrong, but around that time, and for several thousand years either side, this is what Beringia looked like. Siberia was here, you could walk to Alaska. Currently, the Bering Strait is only about 50 meters deep, and remember that the sea levels dropped to about 120 meters, maybe even over 120 meters. So the sea here, 50 meters deep, the people were walking across here. They weren't boating from Asia to the Americas. When did they do it? Well, it turns out that the earliest dates of any human remains in Alaska are only 11,500 years old. Those are the earliest that anybody can find. We definitely got there earlier, because there's here in Texas, 15,500 years old signs of humans. And the Monte Verde site down in the bottom of Chile, 14,500 years old. A famous site, both because it's so old, both because it's so far from where humans came from, but also famous in anthropology anyway, for the amount of, what shall I say, vituperative disagreement with Tom Dillahay about the dating of his findings. But subsequently, it has been very well established that they were down there 14,500 years ago. Indeed, Tom Dillahay has just published, just November of last year, the suggestion that in fact they'd reached there by 18,000 years ago. Now, about 30 years ago, Nieda Guidon was claiming 30,000 dates for eastern Brazil. And everybody essentially said, don't be stupid. But 18,000 dates, 18,000 years ago down here, now 25,000 years ago, just published a year ago now, 2014, 2 years ago now, I guess, 2014, beginning to look as though Nieda Guidon might in fact have been right after all. But again, early dates that we had, 15,500, 14,500, being thrown out if these far older dates turn out to be correct. There hasn't been time yet for independent assessment of these early dates. Indications that the populations that came out of America, and indeed it's true for the initial population that came out of Africa, were very small populations indeed. You look at the O blood group type up here, they have the normal 3 ABO in roughly equal proportions. One of them was a little bit less than the other. I think it was the B that was less than the other, but essentially 30, 30, 30. But 85% of Native American Indians are O blood group. By the time you're down here, over 95% of Amerindians are O blood group. Implying surely, I certainly don't know, the original geneticists who did this study don't know any other explanation for that, but that very small populations were the founding populations of all the Native Americans and especially the Amerindians. How fast did we get down there? Well, there are several ways we can try to get at that, and one is camp movements of hunter-gatherers around the world at the moment. And there's hunter-gatherers in the Americas, but also in other parts of the world, who will move about 100 kilometers a year, moving camp over a distance of about 100 kilometers a year. 100 kilometers a year for 16,000 kilometers will get you from the top to the bottom of America in 160 years. There's no way, of course, that even geneticists, I suspect, but certainly not archaeologists, are going to be able to pick up that speed of movement. It's essentially instantaneous in the record. Interesting if they did it, but we're not going to be able to know whether they did it or not. There's another way of asking the same question: how fast did humans move through the continent? And one of the main ways that people think that human moved is just by demographic expansion. You get to a certain density, and then the people move on to an empty area ahead of them. Now, there's one place where we have very good idea indeed of how fast a human population can expand. It's Pitcairn Island, where Mel Gibson on the Bounty found himself after he had thrown Fletcher Christian off the boat. I assume you all know the story. Actually, maybe the Utes in the audience don't know the story. Mutiny on the Bounty, mutiny. Captain Bligh was put on a boat and sent off to survive. He did a several thousand kilometer voyage into Eastern Asia. But he and a bunch of his mutineers picked up a bunch of ladies from the Easter Islands and settled on the formerly empty Pitcairn Island. So we know exactly when they did it. They kept records of what their population was doing, so we know the rate of population increase. Let's assume that a population will move on, a hunter-gatherer population will move on if it reaches a density of 1 per kilometer squared. Let's give them a starting population, and this is Paul Martin's analyses, of 100, and it will take them 340 years by demographic expansion to move from Alaska down to the bottom of South America. To move down the length of North America, and presumably as much again down to the bottom of South America. So again, probably a speed of movement that one simply could not pick up. And here's another speed of movement that people might not be able to pick up. 16,000 kilometers in roughly 2,000 years. That's definitely an arm-waving estimate for how long it took people to get from Alaska to the bottom of South America. But let's say it was 2,000 years to go 16,000 kilometers. That works out at 22 meters a day. I am sure there are some mothers in this audience who've experienced their baby going at least 22 meters a day and getting in a panic because baby's no longer where she's left it. This is a demographic expansion. This is not, let's move on, let's move camp 100 kilometers per year. Most people reckon that humans moved across the world by demographic expansion, not simply by walking as they saw greener pastures ahead of them. How can we get at information to see this movement down here, actual hard information? You will have noticed, I guess by now, that I've put most of our movement down the coasts of the world. I'll come on to why I think that's a very likely route that we initially took across the world. The problem with doing any archaeology to find out whether we actually moved down the coast of the world is here is the coastline, now underwater at about the time that we moved down the coast of America, if indeed we moved down the coast of America. You have to be an underwater archaeologist if you're going to find any signs of that first movement, if it went fast down the coast of the two continents. Underwater archaeology has in fact been done. They have found some signs up here. As far as I remember, it was Washington. As far as I remember, it came from about 11,000 years ago. At this time, there was this massive ice sheet on top of America, which reached down to New York. You can see that now actually in New York Central Park. This is a boulder in New York Central Park, and there are plenty of them, and these scrapes here are glacial scrapes from the ice sheet that used to cover, to a depth of something like 2,000 feet, the whole of where New York is now. So people, if they moved across like the Texans once, I reckon they had to have come down here and then moved across here. By about 14,000 years ago, there was a corridor here between those two massive ice sheets that had opened. This is a picture that I've taken of what edge of an ice sheet, edge of an ice sheet looks like. You cannot live there. It's just a mound of rubble and sand and water and lakes. It's absolutely unlivable place. Surely not for several hundred years could anybody have moved through here, and it would have taken them probably several tens of years at least to have moved through here. But give it 1,000 years, we get to 13,000 years, which is the time that the Clovis culture moved into America. And this is the region of the height of the Clovis culture here. Looks maybe as if this late arriving Clovis culture could have come down, what they call the ice-free corridor between these two ice sheets. But certainly other people had got there before them. Oysters. This is an oyster. I happen to think they're disgusting. Lots of people think they taste delicious. The important thing about oysters is on all the coasts of the world, there are hundreds of thousands of them, and they are very nutritious indeed. And around all the coasts of the world, you find oyster mounds. Here's one in Texas. Here's one in the Philippines. Here in California is a mound of oyster shells, happen to be covered by grass, Shell Mound Street in a town just south of here, as far as I remember. And here's one in Australia, trees growing on it, it's so big. Oysters are very nutritious food. My reasoning for believing that humans moved around the world first along the coasts is because of oysters. You can tell your 5-year-old kid, go out and get some oysters. Students from the Department of Anthropology watched kids in the Torres Strait between New Guinea and Australia collecting oysters. They could, in 1 hour, collect 1 kilo of shelled oysters. Can you imagine being a parent, being able to tell your kid, go out and get some oysters, enough for breakfast, lunch, and supper? I really think that oysters fueled the first human movement around the world. And certainly there's some evidence that they did so. Well, we didn't stay only on the coast, we moved inland as well. And Tibet, at an altitude of around 4,000 meters, there's signs of humans 30,000 years ago. And this is genetic signs of humans 30,000 years ago in Tibet, in the heights of Tibet. No idea how they got there. They presumably didn't go over the Himalayas. That would have been too difficult. Around here and in here, maybe up here and then down through here. Who knows how they got there? But we know they were there 30,000 years ago. Into the heights of the Andes around 12,000 years ago. Excuse me. These are archaeological data. In Peru, people at these heights that you can see here, around 12,000 years ago. But north of North America, northern Canada, of course, we had to wait until the ice sheets disappeared from there before anybody could possibly live there. So you've got the Inuit moving into here, into Alaska, and then the Eskimo Aleut people around 5,000 years ago is what the records seem to indicate. Post-Ice Age, what about movement back into Europe? Well, there's evidence that the Basque people from northern Spain were back in western Britain by 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago is when, in effect, livestock keeping and agriculture started in the Middle East. Up here, they were still hunter-gatherers at this time. Around 3,000 years ago, there's evidence that people from here moved back into Africa, and surely there will have been lots of movement to and fro in Africa. The interesting thing about this movement here is that they moved as far as East Africa. These are genetic data, this wonderful Hellenthal study here, genetic data that people moved into East Africa by then. And then 1,500 years ago, they moved into South Africa. They moved into the Khoisan people of southern Africa. there are two genetically distinct populations, but culturally fairly indistinguishable populations in Southern Africa. One of them almost purely African. This one with genes here from first of all Europe and then East Africa. About, as far as I remember, the figure is 10% of their genotype is, in fact, from the Middle East. The original ones there, the ones that are essentially largely African, three main colors, if you like, in the colored column of the variety of their genes. The other people, also some people, also in South Africa, as I say, culturally fairly indistinguishable, they've got about 10 different colors. They have come, their origins, genetic origins, from many different places, as I say, including Europe, which is really rather surprising. The Celts moving into Britain about a little bit less than 3,000 years ago, bringing magnificent culture and agriculture with them. What should I be pointing at? There we go. And then the Anglo-Saxons about 1,500 years ago. Now, these guys are interesting. There's always been a question. It seems to me that Luigi Cavalli-Sforza solved it, answered it for almost everywhere in the world. When people move, can culture move independently of them, or can culture move only if the people move? And almost all of the evidence indicates that culture does not move unless the people move. There's obvious indication of that in Britain at the moment. No Brit in their right mind would ever eat frogs, or snails indeed, and yet, of course, the French, just the other side of the channel, think that frogs and snails are perfectly good things to eat. Culture doesn't move independently of people almost all the time. But these Anglo-Saxons are interesting. There's a site in Oxford of 19 skeletons that have been buried with Anglo-Saxon cultural material. So it's an Anglo-Saxon burial. 18 of the people, and it's a mixed burial of males and females, 18 of the people, the isotope analysis of their bones indicate that they are native-born Britons. Only one of them, the isotope analysis of their bones, indicate that they came from the core area of the Anglo-Saxons, Germany. So we've got here a people, presumably original Celtic people, who adopted the culture of the advanced invaders. An unusual case of that happening. Where should I point this thing? At this? Up there? Folks, nothing's happening. There we go. This is a recent, very interesting map of the genetic geography of Western Europe. These genes or types here are coded according to these colors here. The colors mean only where the person genes were. It's where their grandparents' genes came from, where their grandparents were, or where they themselves were if the people who did the study could not find where the grandparents were. Each of these is an individual person. Each little initial here is an individual person. Each initial there has been given the latitude and longitude of the person from whom the genes were taken. And you can see that the genetic map of Europe is essentially the same as the geographic map of Europe, meaning that even in Europe, roads, airplanes, railways, bicycles, all means of travel that you like across Europe, nevertheless, it looks as though people stay where they were born. Here's Great Britain here. There are, in some cases, folks, you're going to have to move this at the top, I think. This is no longer working. In some cases, there are barriers that are keeping people apart. This is water barriers, of course. Here are mountain barriers, Alps and Pyrenees here. Water barrier here, the English Channel and the Irish Channel there. But with some of these areas, there are essentially no barriers. As I say, these barriers are really easily crossed. And yet, Novembre could say, tell me your genotype, and I can tell you where you come from. And I think what we're getting here is not geographic barriers to movement, but cultural barriers to movement. As I put it, if I can't whisper sweet nothings to the lady in Paris, nothing is going to come of our meeting. And European people very rarely can speak the language of another country. Iceland, part of Europe, whoops, this time it did work, separated into two parts of Iceland. Icelandic, the language, is almost as indistinguishable between the west and the east of Iceland. At the same time, the eastern Iceland, both males and females come from Norway. The Vikings are Norwegian, the Vikings peopled Iceland. Icelandic people can still read Viking runes. Next, please. But the males in Western Ireland come from Norway. The females, though, come from Western Britain. Clearly, Viking raids into Western Britain, picking up females and taking them to the west of Iceland, because the Norwegian Icelanders had already conquered the eastern island. Another incidence of a separation between genes and culture. Next, there we go. This might be working now. So we're now moving across the oceans. You've seen some of these dates here. Got as far as the Solomons about 30,000 years ago, the longest sea crossing there about 70 kilometers. Took a long time to go any further. Another 25,000 years, essentially, before we get the Lapita culture down here, this pottery culture, which got about as far out as Fiji, maybe a little bit further than Fiji. And then, with the development of long-distance, large-scale oceanic canoes starting to move across the Pacific Islands. So getting to Tahiti at about 2,000 years ago, Hawaii at 1,500 years ago. By 1,000 years ago, they're actually trading with South America. Genetic indications that the yam, a South American plant, had reached Tahiti by 1,000 years ago. So there's movement to and fro now across the Pacific. And then finally to New Zealand, only about 700 years ago. And they did not come from the nearest landmass, Australia. They came from the Cook Islands, 2,500 kilometers away. And genetic indications are that the founding population, the population of females that actually led to the Maori population, only about 70 of them. And to some extent, the movement here reminds me of fish, I've got to say, even though we're talking about humans. As you move out from here, high diversity, genetic diversity of humans here. The further you move out, the lower the genetic and cultural diversity, until here in New Zealand, you have just one culture, essentially one genotype, if you like. These guys doing the same as your fish there. The other ocean of the world, the Indian Ocean, also not reached until only a few thousand years ago. The interesting thing about this is that the people that peopled Madagascar, they come from a variety of places in Indonesia. We know this genetically. A variety of places in Indonesia, probably a seafaring people, sailors moving around Indonesia. Probably they came via there, down to there. But the Madagascar language, Malagasy, is most closely related, not just to any old language here, but to this language, Barito, here in southeastern Borneo. They can understand one another, apparently, Malagasy and these Borneans. And the architecture in Madagascar, anybody who's been to both Indonesia and Madagascar, this will look terribly familiar to any Indonesian who goes to Madagascar. Maybe a little later, maybe at the same time, people from Africa arrived in Madagascar. And then finally, of course, the French arrived in Madagascar, bringing with them the epitome of French culture, the baguette. I've got to tell you, the best baguettes I've ever tasted are Malagasy baguettes. So a wonderful mixture, Madagascar, of these three main cultures. There's some evidence that humans reached, this is archaeological evidence, reached Madagascar 3,500 years ago. If they did, as far as the evidence indicates at the moment, they disappeared until these ones arrived again at 2,000 years ago. Is that because they were wiped out by their first arrivals? Is that because they didn't manage to survive in Madagascar? Who knows? But no traces of them, no genetic traces of them, only archaeological traces of them. Well, moving on to the second part, if you like, but it's only about the next 10 minutes, part of the talk, human cultural diversity. If you go to a physical anthropology textbook, you will not find, in any that I have managed to find, any discussion of the variety of cultures across the world, the geographic distribution of cultures across the world. And that's what I want to end on quite quickly, I hope. I liken the movement of people across the world to something that microbiologists do. They will take a flask, pour that flask into another flask, take a subset of that flask and move it into another flask, and occasionally, by mistake or deliberately, put the flasks in different environments. And that's definitely what's happened with the human movement across the world. I might say that the genetic variety of humans, that all 7 billion of us, approaching 8 billion of us, is apparently less than you'll find in some single populations of chimpanzees. We are essentially one subspecies. Here is the distribution of cultures across the world from this wonderful, if anybody wants to go to it, free site, the Ethnologue site. Each of these spots is a different language. And what you can see is a concentration in the tropics. All come from one place, then diversify in the tropics. We don't diversify out of the tropics. That's a map. Here are some data, the number of languages in relation to latitude along the bottom for the different continents that you can see there, differences among the continents, but essentially what you get is diversity in the tropics and not much diversity outside of the tropics. Tropics, of course, each of these continents differs in area, so you take the density of peoples across the world in relation to latitude, and again, what you're finding is the density of cultures is highest in tropical areas, lowest outside of tropical areas. You've got a difference, between islands here and mainlands here. The slope of the relationship between area and variety is less than 1. Take the residual number of languages from the slopes, and the slope for islands is the same as the slope for mainlands. Lots of diversity in the tropics, not much diversity outside of the tropics. Lots of diversity in the tropics, not much diversity outside of the tropics. I challenge you to tell me which one of these graphs is monkeys and apes and which one of those graphs is humans. They look about the same. That indicates to me that there might be some biology to the distribution of human cultures across the world. Indicates to some other people as well that there might be some biology to the distribution of human cultures. This one, colored one, is in fact the monkeys and apes. It's a graph produced by, you can see my name there. The one up there, I also produced the graph, but definitely from other people's data. Same distribution across the world of animals and humans. And probably the same explanation, or at least the same, partly the same explanation. Look at diversity and environment. You've got latitudinal bands along the top 2 x-axes, productivity along the y-axis up at the left there. Productivity falls with latitude. Number of hunter-gatherer societies falls with latitude. These are mean numbers per 5-degree latitudinal band. Excluding North America and Australia and islands, I can tell you why. There's reasons to exclude those. And so you get hunter-gatherers doing the same, in fact, as monkeys and apes, doing the same as lots of species, wide variety of hunter-gatherer societies where there's high productivity, low variety where there's low productivity. Familiar to lots of, a familiar pattern to lots of biogeographers, almost whatever sort of phylum you're looking at. Why are we getting high diversity in the tropics? To some extent, it's for the same reason as animals and plants, and that is, the background to this is humans are highly territorial. If you're going to get high diversity of cultures, languages in any particular area, it is because they cover a small area. Almost nowhere do human cultures overlap. And here you've got then the high diversity of humans in the tropics matches small cultural area in the tropics by comparison to outside of the tropics. In the tropics, there is lots of food year-round. You can live in a small area. A population of sustainable size can live in a small area year-round. That's not the case outside of the tropics. For 6 months of the year, nothing is growing outside of in the Arctic, for example. These are, what you can see here is the data for hunter-gatherer societies and the data for languages, both showing the same pattern. Lots of variance around the pattern, of course, lots of other influences on the area that a culture covers, but nevertheless looking as though there is some relationship to habitat. True in the Americas as well. This is the Great Plains, no mountains in the way, no rivers in the way, and yet you get small territories here, large territories here. I might point out these white territories here, no Native American Indians left by the time that people were gathering data on where Native American Indians lived. And here's the number of language families in the Americas in relation to latitude, showing the same relationship as across the tropics to the very high latitudes. Diversity at low latitudes, not much diversity at high latitudes. And it isn't just a latitudinal relationship that we see. There are other phylogeographic hotspots as well, mountains of phylogeographic hotspots. You can see here the Himalayas and New Guinea. What's going on in mountains, of course, is that it's difficult to move along mountains, usually difficult to move along mountains. And New Guinea is very characteristic. Each valley has its own language group. It is really difficult to move to another language group. They also happen to be highly aggressive to people from other cultures, rather the same as people across much of the world. They really don't like having anything to do with other cultures. Africa's an interesting one, high diversity of cultures here, especially in Nigeria. Nigeria has one of the highest densities of languages in the world. The interesting thing about Nigeria is there are no geographic barriers. And I haven't managed to find in the sociocultural literature any explanation at all of why Nigeria should have such a high density of cultures. I think biogeographers, maybe phylogeographers I ought to call ourselves given the nature of the conference, might be able to tell the social anthropologists why Nigeria has such a high density of cultures. Come on. South America, especially Amazon, as a tropical area, has a surprisingly low density of cultures. You can see it's far higher in Asia and Africa. Is a reason for that they simply haven't had time to diversify, given how recently people got into South America? A possibility. It's not moving. There we go. Here's another reason why there might be a low diversity of cultures in South America. The Europeans moving into South America brought with them old world diseases that the South Americans, having come from Siberia, where no old world disease survives, were completely unresistant to. Smallpox apparently killed, in some cases, up to 90% of the population. On average, maybe 70% of the population. Was the arrival of Europeans with their diseases enough to produce this blank area on the map there? Given that the blank area is in the middle of the Amazon, I'm not too sure whether that's the case. But it might be one explanation for the paucity of cultures in the Americas. We know how physically brutal the arriving Europeans were to the South Americans. At the same time, this is where the first Europeans arrived in Central America, and there's a high density of cultures still in Central America. It is associated with it being a mountainous country. But I don't really know what's going on in South America, why we should have so few cultures there. Well, human phylogeography is continuing its course. Humans are continuing to move across the world. Here we are arriving in the Americas. Here we are arriving from Africa again into Europe, into Canada as well. Here is a modern aspect, a highly lucrative area of modern American culture. The Star Wars, this particular Star Wars has made over $1 billion. The Star Wars Enterprise, apparently, and I choose that name advisedly, has made over $5 billion. Have a look at the names of the people associated with technological enterprise, technological excellence in the production of the epitome of American culture. I don't know. Thank you very much.